Yes, although Ukraine is not part of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg's visit to Kyiv yesterday was the first time he's actually visited, and he re-emphasised Ukraine's rightful places within NATO, and he also charted a course for Ukraine to actually graduate into NATO ownership. But it was interesting today that the Kremlin has also made clear that one of the reasons they invaded Ukraine was to stop Ukraine from joining NATO. But today, Stoltenberg has increased the rhetoric even further. As you say, he's said that all NATO members now agree that Ukraine will eventually join NATO. This was on the eve of the Ukrainian contact group that's happening in Ramstein tomorrow. This is the US-led coalition of the willing that are coordinating military aid for Ukraine. It's not just NATO, it's NATO plus, really.
And it's interesting, isn't it? How significant do you think this moment is, the fact that NATO moving towards accepting Ukraine as a member?
It's very significant, but I think for me the real question is whether actually Ukraine is being looked to be fast-tracked. If you recall that Finland was fast-tracked into NATO, the fastest a nation's ever been, and Sweden likewise, they're expecting to fast-track that through too. But of course, both those nations already met NATO requirements, but they wanted to remain neutral. As soon as they decided they didn't want neutrality, it was almost like they were pre-approved. Whereas there are very strict entry requirements for entering NATO. We don't have the time to go through them now, but one of them is the ability to make meaningful and significant military contributions to NATO. And it'll be quite some time before Ukraine manages to meet that requirement. And also, it's worth pointing out that at the end of the war between Russia and Ukraine, there will need to be a negotiation. It's very difficult to see that Russia would agree to any negotiated settlement that saw Ukraine join NATO. So the real issue there is, what are the security arrangements for Ukraine at the end of the conflict? And almost certainly President Zelensky will not accept a spoken word or written bit of paper, given that in 1994, the Budapest Memo was signed that guaranteed the sovereignty and the security of Ukraine, which Russia ignored completely 30 years later.
That's really interesting, all the different consequences of this to be worked out. And whenever we have you on, Sean, I always like to get a bit of a sense about what the latest situation is on the ground in Ukraine. So what can you tell us?
Well, I think the most fascinating story today is the Russians admitting that last night an Su-34, one of their state-of-the-art fighters, actually bombed one of their own cities up at Belgorod, which is only about 30 miles away from the Ukrainian border. Interestingly, there's a big crater made in the middle of the city, 20 metres wide. It upturned a car as well, and apparently we've got reports of at least 2 casualties, only injured, although if you see by the state of the devastation, it's hard to imagine that won't increase. The Su-34 is actually a state-of-the-art, relatively modern Soviet aircraft. About 10% of these have been lost since the start of the war. That's about 19 platforms. The real question is, how on earth did this happen? Initial reports say for the Russians that they had jettisoned the weapons. Well, as a former fighter pilot myself, you have the ability to jettison stores, fuel tanks and weapons, but when they leave the aircraft, they leave in an unarmed state. They cannot possibly explode, whereas these blew up when they hit their target. So almost certainly they were intended to be released. The challenge is, did the pilot misidentify a target? 30 miles away from enemy territory, so it looks unlikely. What looks most likely is that before this fighter pilot entered into Ukraine airspace, he was probably doing some training, getting used to the switchery, practicing attacks on targets without actually intending to release a bomb, made his switches live and inadvertently released a bomb which caused such devastation on the ground. The Russian fighter, this is a very capable fighter, but it just illustrates that equipment alone is not military capability. Their pilots are good, but they don't get the flying hours, they don't have the simulator time, and this is a very embarrassing incident, but it also highlights the relative incompetence of some of the Russian Air Force pilots.